Hi, everybody. Welcome back again to Introduction to Ethics. I'm continuing where we left off last time, where we were dealing with the issues that we called problems in grounding morality. And those went along with PowerPoints 2 and 3. And what I'm going to be doing today is bringing you through the next PowerPoint, which is going to be PowerPoint number 4 for you, where we're going to be dealing with a few of the problems that we raised last time. So we're going to be presenting certain perspectives that philosophers have that address some of the issues that we brought up. And we're just going to go through these, hopefully in an organized way. What you'll need to do is probably go back through the PowerPoints as you prepare for tests and stuff like that, because some of this material gets a little bit more complicated than the initial material that we looked at last time. Okay, so we're going to start with let me just switch over, make sure that you are getting the presentation. Okay. This should be working now. Start the presentation over again. Okay, so we're just calling this again the foundations of morality, and we're going to be talking again about foundationalism. So the first problems that we addressed last time were these 5. Okay, I'm going to just go back through these 5 problems one at a time in a very, very brief way, hopefully, just so that you know the issue that's raised with each of these problems and why it undercuts the ability to talk about moral philosophy in general and ethics. So the foundationalist perspective is, again, you need to have some kind of foundation that you build an ethical theory on. You need to have some kind of ground or stable starting point when you're dealing with moral claims. Now, the 5 problems that I gave you are not necessarily the only 5 problems that are out there, but these 5 problems, if you remember, were the fact-value distinction, also called the is-ought problem, the problem of determinism, the problem of relativism, logical positivism, which was really an issue for the middle of the 20th century. It's a particular view, philosophical view, that did raise problems for ethics. It's not really a problem so much anymore. And then the issue of existentialism and what that might entail for moral philosophy. So going back through the problems on your screen, you can see that the fact-value distinction basically implies that you cannot have a foundation for morality grounded in facts about the world, and therefore morality might not be able to be connected with some kind of true, objectively true states. Okay, so we'll look at that one first. Actually, this PowerPoint is going to deal with a perspective on the fact-value distinction that hopefully will alleviate it, and it's from one particular philosophical point of view, which I'll get to in a second. The next problem was determinism, which was the case, if it is the case, I should say, that we are nothing more than beings who are determined in our physicality, and for instance, if this is a purely materialistic universe, and we are nothing more than rather complicated machines that operate according to the laws of cause and effect and natural laws, whatever, and all of our actions are really the result of various stimulus, impulse, response mechanisms, then if that is the case, if we are determined in that manner, then there really is no meaning in talking about us being responsible for what we do or saying that we ought to do anything in particular, because that would just merely be an illusion. We may seem to have obligations, but you can't really have an obligation if you don't have the power to act on your own, if you're completely determined. So we'll look at some perspectives on determinism as well, some different views at the end of this PowerPoint. And those are really the 2 problems that I'm going to deal with today. But just for the sake of going through the other 3, which we'll deal with next time, we have relativism, which I'll spend a good amount of time. And relativism is, again, the view that morals are really nothing more than moral opinions. And different cultures have different views or beliefs, again, judgments and opinions about various things. And therefore, there are no true rights and wrongs that we could call universal or objective. Maybe I should say universal and just leave it at that. Problem 4 with logical positivism is kind of a scientific view of things that kind of reduces meaningful statements down into 2 basic camps. And we saw last time that moral statements don't fall into either of those 2 basic camps, or at least can't be measured as value or meaningful according to the 2 criteria of the logical positivist verification theory. Therefore, according to the logical positivist, moral claims really are meaningless and definitely can't be considered true or false. And then the last thing was existentialism, where we looked at this issue of absolute human autonomy and freedom that many existentialists hold, where we are so free that we can make and determine our own morality. Again, if we can basically choose for ourselves what is right, what is wrong, then again, there is nothing that binds us to a particular morality. There's no obligation. And again, ethics may be something that we really can't talk about except beyond a subjective approach. All right, with those problems kind of reintroduced, what I'm going to go on to is talk about a possible way to ground ethics. And this next slide, I'm just going to skip past that because we already talked about what a ground is. Now, before I get to the actual fact-value distinction and that issue, how we might be able to resolve it, I'm going to introduce some metaphysics. Unfortunately, metaphysics can be a little bit complicated, and the metaphysics I'm going to deal with is going to begin in this issue of what we call universals and the philosophical perspectives that we might call realism or anti-realism. And again, the setup here is that it's possible, according to a realist interpretation of things, and what we're going to be doing is looking at things from a moderate realist perspective. The moderate realist philosopher is going to see ethics as something that we can find a foundation for in what we might call essence or essential natures or natures. So we need to maybe deal a little bit with these terms, what they might mean, and how these will apply to ethics. And like I said in the introduction lecture, a lot of times you cannot separate ethics completely from metaphysics. So let's begin with this issue of realism. What is it? It's a little bit abstract. So realism is a perspective with respect to this question of what we call universals. So what is a universal? Universal is just a class of mind-independent entities that are often contrasted with particulars. So we could postulate the existence of something in a universal fashion as opposed to certain things that we might call particular instances of those universals. And I may not be saying this exactly the right way, but I'm just going to give you a roundabout way of talking about things. So if I talk about, maybe if I go into the desk and talk about a pen, which I just dropped on the ground, a pen, right, is a particular object. And yet we can think of a pen in a universal way so that when I mention pen and you understand what I'm talking about, you've got something in mind that isn't a particular pen. You don't necessarily have this pen in mind. When we're talking about pens, you've got a concept in your head that applies to all pens, and we'd say that that concept is universal. Now, I'm not just reducing universals to mere concepts. That's one particular view on realism that we'll get to in a second, but it might be more appropriate in ethics to talk about the concept of humanity or human nature as a universal. And that would be something that unites all people, all humans, together in a certain way, because there's this thing that makes us all the same, at least the same type of thing, even though we're each individual particular human beings. Okay, so these universals are postulated to ground and explain relations of qualitative identity and resemblance among individuals. So what makes me qualitatively the same as you is the fact that there is something there that we both share, which might be this universal. Okay, and that in virtue of which universals are said to be similar to one another. And it's really an important concept, I think, when it comes to looking at big issues in ethics, such as the belief in equality, the belief in, human beings all being equal and of certain worth and value. It's hard to ground that particular belief. Most people accept that idea today, that everybody's equal, but they might not be able to explain why people are equal or have a ground for that belief or some kind of principle that it's rooted in. Once you dismiss the ideas of universals, if you have the concept of a universal human nature that we all share in, that gives a very strong foundation for being able to say that all people are equal, and so on. So you basically get the gist of things. Now, when it comes to realism, there's really three perspectives that I'm going to give you that are considered realist points of view, and two perspectives that are considered anti-realist points of view. And they're basically in how they deal with this issue of universals. The first three, which are realist points of view, do see universals as real things, or at least having some element of reality or being to them, whereas the last two don't really acknowledge the true reality of universals. So the first couple views, I'm going to go through these quickly because it's not something you're going to be tested on, with maybe the exception of moderate and scholastic realism. But when we start with extreme realism, that's a view that was associated with Plato. And he talked about universals. I use the word forms, often ideas, how it might be translated. And he talks about these things, these forms, as substantial entities. These are things that really exist. And not only really exist, they exist in a more real way than the particular things that we see around us in everyday world. He actually posits that these universals or forms exist in this other world. We might just call it the world of the forms, for instance, where we in the physical world that we're in are existing in might be what's called the sensible world, or the world of the receptacle, or something along those lines. So these things actually exist apart from the particular. And the reason that you call me a human being and the next person a human being is because we resemble or reflect this actual perfect form of humanness that exists out there. But it still is what gives us all a sense of identity as a same type of thing. Okay, now that's an extreme form. A lot of people don't believe that kind of account for universals. After Plato, you have a big challenge to this view by his most famous student, Aristotle. And Aristotle we would classify as a moderate realist. He does believe in the reality of universals. But for him, a universal is going to exist not in another realm, but right here, though we could talk about universals in a way of as only existing within the mind. Now, okay, so form as form, right? If you're just going to use that term, and we're not going to go into all the details about what these things mean, but let's put it this way. Aristotle believed that any substance or thing, substance is what we might call a thing, is composed of two principles. We're not going to call those principles actual things because they don't exist in and of themselves. It's only the substance that exists, the thing itself. But the two principles that that compose the substance are what he calls form and matter. Okay. Now, using the human being as an example, the form of a human he would call a soul. He would use that term of any living thing to talk about the form of that thing. And the matter of that particular living being would be the body. Okay, so to make a long story short, to illustrate this in a very quick way, I have the form of humanness. Okay, and you have the same form as I do, which makes us the same type of thing. So form accounts for what we are. We have different bodies, however. My body's here, your body's there. That makes us individual instances of humanness in different places. So it's the form that accounts for what we are. It's the body that accounts, or the matter that accounts for that we are this particular instance of that. Okay? Now, in general, when we use the word form, we're not talking universal or particular. It's that the universal is, or the form rather, is universal when we hold it in our minds. Okay? And those universals are instantiated and particularized in the individual thing. So as that form resides in one person, then it's a particular person. If that form resides in another piece of matter, and then it exists as a particular person in a different place. Okay? So, again, the reality of universals is grounded in something real, which happen to be the particulars, but it's not that the universal is just a mere concept that I have. It actually is something substantially, not substantial, it is something real. Okay, let's put it that way. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. A lot of times you need an illustration to help make sense of that. So hopefully the one I gave you is going to work. very slight modification on the moderate realist view of Aristotle would be the scholastic realist perspective, Thomas Aquinas. And we'll study Thomas a little bit later when we do natural law theory. And Aquinas essentially follows Aristotle very, very closely. He has a few modifications. For instance, being a Christian philosopher, he has a place for God in his philosophy. And the big key difference here, if you look at the center of the screen, is that universals actually pre-exist eternally in the mind of God. And Aquinas would realize that, Aristotle doesn't necessarily ground his forms or the universals in a way that might be needed. For instance, what accounts for the fact that there is such thing as a universal humanness or whatever? Aquinas realizes these things have to be grounded in a creator. So it's the mind of God that holds all of these forms initially, and then these universals are instantiated and particularized into different things as things are created. So that's the only difference really, is that the forms actually pre-exist eternally in the mind of God in a certain sense. Okay. And the last two views, conceptualism and nominalism, I'm not really going to distinguish these two, but let's just suffice to say that these two views do not believe that universals are real things. Okay, they're either just concepts or just names, might have some kind of mental existence, but there's nothing metaphysically real about them. They're just ways that we group things that seem to be similar. We'll just pick out the similarities and put them together in a group. Okay, so now, what we're going to do is we're going to look, well, first, I guess, at some metaphysical terms that you probably should know. I've already used a few of these, such as form and substance. So, again, let me just read through these, and I'll maybe use another example if I need to. Don't worry about this general definition of essence. Actually, let me read it. Why not? So essence in general is that thing in virtue of which an object is what it is one example of a particular kind of thing. Okay, the form, like I said, is a metaphysical principle by which an act of existence is made into some one individual of a particular kind. So, again, the form is the thing that, again, makes something what it is. It's a principle, but not a thing. Whereas the substance is the actual thing that includes that principle. Okay, so it's going to be something we use to explain a particular ontological unit, meaning a particular existing thing. Some of these terms are really big and broad, so I'll just say ontological refers to something as an existing being for the most part. All right. The proper definition of essence is a little bit more full than the general one that I just gave you. So once we know what a form is, we could say that the form in the presence of the rational instinct is the essence. Okay, that which is picked out or separated from the thing itself. And let me just sum this up in a quick way. As you go through life, you encounter different things that the senses have access to. All right, from the moderate realist perspective. You see a dog, and you see a second dog, and you see a third dog, and you see these things all through life, various instances where you are having an experience. And through the process of induction, we are going to, again, eventually draw certain pieces of information, maybe we say, into our mind. Okay, and what we're doing is a process known as abstraction. We're abstracting from each particular instance that we see certain essential elements. Okay, and what we come away with is not a particular dog, but we come out with the essence of what it means to be a dog. Okay, and we might call this the concept. So when the form is brought into the rational mind where it can be defined, we've got this concept, all right, or this essence. And we could also use the term nature very often in ethics as kind of an overlap with form or essence. Some of these terms can be used interchangeably, even though there's very subtle distinctions that are made between them. For instance, when we talk about the nature of a thing, we're talking about the form in relation to how that thing operates, its activities, or its faculties. Okay. Now, just to give an example of basically this idea of essential qualities in things, I'm just going to use the example of a triangle. A lot of times geometric figures work pretty well. you've got certain properties that we could observe in particular instances of triangles. For instance, you could have a triangle drawn on a piece of paper that has a particular color to it. Maybe it's a yellow triangle. Maybe it's a triangle that is only yay big. Maybe it's a triangle that is, a right triangle, has a particular set of angles, and so on. Now, the concept, the universal essence of triangularity, if we want to call it that, doesn't take into consideration those types of things. Color is not something that's essential to the nature of a triangle. Neither is size. Neither is being a right triangle versus an isosceles, etc. Okay, there are certain properties we call essential, and those would be the properties that are true of all triangles, such as having 3 sides, having 180 degrees interior. Those types of things we call essential properties. So once you grasp that, what you've grasped is triangleness. Okay, this universal concept that will apply to all triangles, whether they're poorly drawn by a computer, imagined, etc., etc., etc. Okay, now, why am I going through all this? Well, it's because I want to get to this fact-value distinction, and we're going to go and look at Aristotle, who happens to be a moderate realist, how he would deal with this issue of fact versus value. Remember, the problem that was raised is that facts cannot lead you to values. Factual claims or descriptive claims about the way the world is do not lead you to be able to conclude anything about the way things ought to be or what is valuable. Okay, and we use the example of torturing innocent children. You can say a lot of factual things about what that entails, but it's hard to then jump directly to the conclusion that it's wrong to torture innocent children just based on the fact. And this was kind of raised by Hume. So, a few things that I'm going to bring in here are this issue of desire. Okay, where desires play a role in determining what's good and bad. So that's going to relate a little bit to the naturalistic fallacy that we talked about. And then I want to talk about whether or not there is any connection between values and facts. And Aristotle is actually going to believe that there is. Okay, so first let's talk about Aristotelian judgment types. He says that there are 2 basic types of judgment, at least relevant for us. The first type of judgment is this descriptive judgment, right? This would be a matter of fact that we're dealing with. So, we have already said matters of fact can be judged to be true or false. Okay, and we're using fact as an objective, right? I think we defined these before. The second type of judgment would be, and let me give you an example of a descriptive before I go on, matter of fact, right? When I say it is sunny outside, that statement is a descriptive statement about the nature of the world outside this house. And that can be judged as true or false based on whether or not my statement corresponds. We're going to have to talk about the correspondence view of truth as well, whether that corresponds to the actual state of affairs outside, whether it's sunny. If it's sunny, it's true. If it's not sunny, it's false. Okay. So, the second type of judgment is called a prescriptive judgment. This is telling us what we ought to do or what we should do. Think of it like going to the doctor and getting a prescription. A prescription is supposed to tell you what you should take, right? Or what you should do as far as bed rest or anyways, you get the idea. They're not exactly the same types of things. Assertions that something is really good is equivalent to saying something ought to be pursued. So when we say X is good for me, what you're saying, according to Aristotle, is that X is something I ought to pursue, right? Because it's right, and you should pursue what's good. And we call these matters of value. And the problem is, are they things we can say are true or false? Okay, and on what basis? Okay, are they mere opinion, or there's something behind them that we could somehow ground these oughts in? All right. Now, the first error that I'm just going to introduce is called Spinoza's error. Benedict Spinoza, modern philosopher, who has a view of good, which he relates to desire in such a way that he says, if something is desired, then it's good. Okay, it being desired is sufficient for it being considered good. Now, if this is his definition of what good is, whatever is desired, then of course we've got this naturalistic problem that we looked at last time. But you also have a problem that this leads to the view of relativism, which we looked at as well. So just imagine this, that everything, Well, not everything that appears good to you appears good to somebody else. So let's use the example of stealing. If I have the desire to steal and somebody else has the desire not to steal, then for me, because it's my desire and whatever is desired is good, then stealing would be good. But for the other person who doesn't desire to steal, for them stealing would not be good. Not stealing would be good. So here's this instance of stealing, which could be judged as both good and bad at the same time, just by different people, which ultimately is the view we call relativism. Now, the question that you could always ask to this, what I say is a poor definition of what is good, is something good merely because we desire it, or is it actually desired because it's good? I mean, do we desire things because we already see them as good, right? So if I desire to steal, does that make it good, or does it just seem good to me, and that's why I want and have that desire? Okay, so that's a question that I think is a legitimate question that we can ask. Now, putting that aside for a second, let's look at Hume very briefly, because Hume raises this problem about is-ought issue, right? Hume distinguishes descriptive and prescriptive statements, much like Aristotle does, but he argues that the former can't provide grounds to the later, and that's something Aristotle would deny. Okay, the former being the facts cannot provide grounds for the values. The is cannot provide grounds for the oughts. So jump down to this correspondence theory thing. Now, we were just talking about the definition of truth a couple sessions ago, and we said something is true if it corresponds to reality or corresponds to a certain state of affairs. So if I make a statement, it is sunny outside, we just said that that's true if it corresponds or matches the way it actually is outside. Now, the problem here is if that is our definition of truth, that it has to correspond to some kind of reality or fact, then only statements that are descriptive seem to be the types of statements that can be true or false. Okay? Truth is when the idea in the mind corresponds to the way things are, which are facts, and this applies only to descriptive statements, since descriptions are the ones that we call matters of fact. What does a prescriptive statement actually correspond to? Does it correspond to facts? Doesn't seem to. Doesn't seem to be anything in reality that our prescriptive statements correspond to. And if they don't correspond, then according to the definition of truth, they can't be true. This is the problem, okay? Or at least part of the problem. And of course, the consequence of this distinction in moral reasoning is when you're trying to come up with a moral value judgment, you can't get there from a factual statement alone. We saw this before. You have to start with some kind of moral principle or value judgment, general in nature. And we use the example, like you see on the screen, with Terence before. Okay? Now, it could be a valid argument if I start with a moral value judgment. That's a moral principle. And then I can get to my moral conclusion. But the question that we also raised is, how do you get the initial moral value judgment? I just talked about this with some of my students in class the other day, and that was the first thing. They didn't even get to this slide, and they're already asking, well, how do you get the moral principle to begin with? If it's not grounded in facts, where does it come from? Okay, so how do you get that first prescriptive premise? You can't even get off the ground, perhaps, if we can't find a way to ground the principles. So let's look at how we might overcome the fact-value distinction. And let's start with this issue of truth. To affirm the truth of a prescriptive conclusion, obviously we have to combine a descriptive premise with a prescriptive premise, as we just saw. And number two, the prescriptive premise needs to be some kind of premise that you're not going to be able to deny. So Aristotle would say we need to find a self-evident principle. And what I mean by self-evident is, if I understand it, then I can't deny it. Or if I understand it and I can't deny it, then I would say it's an undeniable self-evident truth. It doesn't mean that we all just know this. Okay? It means once you grasp what's being stated and you try to deny it, you're going to realize it's impossible to deny. So let's see if we could find some kind of self-evident truth to get the ball rolling. Now, in the Nicomachean Ethics, this is Aristotle's great work on ethics. He does talk about truth apart from descriptive statements. And he says, some truth does not involve an agreement between mind and reality, this correspondence. Aristotle had that there are different types of truth. So, for instance, there's these prescriptive judgments that we're concerned with. And a prescriptive judgment with respect to the actions that we take are what we call practical judgments, right? Practicality. We're able to put these things into practice in the real world. So practical judgments, he would say, don't require correspondence to matters of fact. They require correspondence to something different. Okay? So the practical judgment, he says, should be in conformity with what he calls right desire, or what we ought to desire. And if it corresponds with right desire, then we could say it's true based on that type of correspondence. Not with facts, but with right desires. Now, as I show you in a minute, right desires are actually grounded in facts. So hold on a second, I'll try to get you there. The question is, what ought we to desire? We can't just say you ought to desire what's good, because again, everybody perceives good as something different. So let's be very careful what we mean by a right desire, because it's true, lots of people desire different things. So it would seem that morality would be relative if we just have to correspond to our desires. But he doesn't say any desire. He says right desires. And what that means, if you look at the screen here, is we have what are called natural desires. You'll see on the next slide that we have what we call acquired desires. And he's making a distinction. A natural desire is a desire that's grounded in your nature. Okay? And therefore, these desires are the same in all humans because all humans share the same nature. So that's how we're getting back to this idea of facts. This idea that there is such a thing as a human nature, which is a factual claim about reality. And it's because of that human nature, which we all share, that we have the same what we call natural desires, or desires rooted in that nature. Therefore, these are desires that everybody has. And therefore, those types of desires, and only those types of desires, we can consider universal and can serve as a ground for our morality. So what do we mean by a natural desire? What we mean are needs. Okay? What everyone really needs is really good. And there are no wrong needs on Aristotle's account. There are lesser and greater goods, maybe lesser and greater needs. I could say I've got a really great need for knowledge, right? You can't get through life without knowing at least a bare minimum of things. Whereas money, we would say that is a need, but that's more based on the way society is structured. And we need it only because it's a tool to get to the other things that we need even more, right? A higher good like food, shelter, clothing, etc. All right. And you can't need in excess things that are really good. You can't have too much of a need for those things, right? You can't say it's an excessive need. You could say it's an excessive want. I like to use the example of going to a buffet, which I do on occasion, and you may be very hungry and you need food to satisfy that desire, that natural desire. Now, sometimes you eat in excess, right? Sometimes you keep going back to the buffet to get your money's worth, and you get really uncomfortable, and sometimes you can't get up out of the chair because it's so painful after you've eaten all that. But the question is, did you need to eat to excess? Well, of course not. You only needed to eat enough to satisfy the desire, the natural desire, your hunger. Beyond that, you've moved into the realm of want. Okay, so you don't actually need to excess, but you can want to excess, and you can consume to excess. Okay, now these real goods, like I said, do not differ from person to person because they're grounded in our nature. One is aware of some needs because of a lack that they bring. That would be a pain. And one may be unaware of certain other needs, like knowledge. We don't always know what we don't know or how important it is to know. But again, the need is there nonetheless. Now, here's the key. Prescriptive judgments have practical truth if they express a desire for a good that we need, that we ought to desire things because of their need, and those are the things that are really good for us. Okay. Now, the acquired desire is easier to understand. These are just our general wants. Okay. So this is a desire that's going to differ from one person to the other. There's nothing that says we all have to have the same wants. I may want a bowl of cornflakes. You may want a bowl of Cheerios. Maybe you don't want either one of those. Maybe you want to go to see a particular movie. I don't like that kind of movie. I've got different desires from you. Okay. So we call these mere wants. And what you want, we would say, is an apparent good. I mean, it looks good to us. That's why we want it. However, it could be, in reality, bad, right? just because it appears good doesn't actually mean it is good, which is why it's very dangerous to say what we desire is good, like Spinoza said. Well, what we desire looks good, but it could be bad because we could be wrong. So if I had this desire to use heroin, for instance, because I know it's going to bring a certain pleasure, perhaps, it appears good to me, but in reality, it's something that's fairly bad for me, right? And I can even understand that and still make a bad decision when my desires are out of control. And we'll talk about that when we do Aristotle later on. Okay, so we call that an apparent want, or at least a good. I'm sorry, an apparent good. So the solution to the fact-value distinction might be bringing in this principle as the only self-evident true prescriptive judgment to start with, or the only one we need to start with. So we'll call it the first principle of moral philosophy in the red. We ought to desire whatever is really good for us and nothing else. So what it's saying, however, is not that you can't desire other things. It's merely saying that we ought to desire the things that are really good. We have an obligation to desire the things that are really good. Other things you may still desire, but we can't say we have an obligation to desire them. Now, as self-evident, you really can't think the opposite. It'd be strange to say that we think that we ought not to desire what's good for us, or that we ought to desire what's bad for us. I may want what's bad for me, and I may desire what's bad for me, but I can't think that I ought to do that. So it seems like a good starting place. Okay? And answering Hume, employ the principle as the prescriptive major premise, add our descriptive premise, and then our conclusion is going to be a prescriptive truth that seems to work. And we could test this just with an example, dealing with needs versus wants, and maybe not be the best example, but let's just use it as a rough example. The idea of murder versus the idea of killing in self-defense. Legal systems have room for killing in self-defense. That's what needs to be proven in many cases, because we realize that when it comes to, say, you're a serial killer and you have murdered somebody and you have desired to murder somebody, you could always ask yourself, is it a desire or is it a need? Is it a want or is it a need? It doesn't seem to ever be a need to murder somebody. And if it is a need to kill somebody, maybe you're in the situation where it's a self-defense scenario, where somebody's about to take your life and there really is no way around saving yourself other than taking that person's life, just as a thought experiment, right? In that case, it might be a need, and therefore would seem to be justifiable and the right thing to do. Okay, again, that would be kind of how this principle works itself out as we reason through different issues. Okay, so let me just finish up this one section, and I'm going to move on to the next issue by saying one more thing about how facts and values really can't be completely divorced. So we've already seen that you can have a fact like nature grounding our desires. And if it's a right desire, it's going to be universal, and therefore we could build a moral foundation. And we could say that, prescriptive statements should correspond to those right desires. All right. To make it even more vivid and to understand why you cannot completely separate values from facts, I could use an example of, again, the type of thing something is. Again, going back to this idea of nature or essence, what something is, has a lot to do with what something's good is, or what something's goal or purpose is. And I'll just use an object as an example. So let's talk about a knife. I like the example of a knife. There are types of things in the world called knives, and they come in all different shapes and all different sizes. But it's a type of thing. So we could say there's a certain essence of a knife that we can understand and grasp. And this idea of what a knife is also entails what we may call a teleology, or a telos, or a purpose, or an end, or a goal for the object, right? So when we think of a knife, you think of a knife that is designed to cut. There's something it's supposed to do, okay? Now, if you get two knives in front of you, and one knife is very sharp and cuts well, and the other knife is very dull and cannot cut a stick of butter, then you can make a judgment about the quality of that knife based on what it is that you know about the knife and the essence of a knife. The one that cuts, we would say, is a good knife. The one that does not cut, we would say, is a bad knife. Right? Now, maybe I'm not using these terms in a moral sense, but I'm showing you still that values cannot be completely divorced from facts. Okay, what you know about the essence of something is related to whether something is a good instance of that type of thing or not. You say the same thing about the human eye. Human eye has a purpose of seeing, helps me navigate through the world. And if my eye was damaged where I could not see, we would say that's a bad eye, right? If I see 20/20, pretty good, right? We do ascribe values based on facts, and Aristotle would agree that facts and values cannot be completely distinct the way Hume said. All right, and we'll talk about that more when we do Aristotle later on. But that's the moderate realist point of view to answer the fact-value distinction. So for some people that aren't moderate realists, they may think the fact-value distinction is a real problem for ethics. Other people, like Aristotle and myself, tend to think fact-value distinction is not really a serious problem. It's something to consider, but it's something we could also get around. All right, the last thing in this particular PowerPoint is going to go back to this issue of determinism. And this is going to be very short in comparison to what we just talked about. Remember the phrase ought implies can. We've got this idea that if you ought to do something, you should have the ability to do it. I can't talk about somebody being responsible for something if you don't have the ability to do something, right? Determinism, we said, is a view that every event is caused. Every event simply follows necessarily from the things that precede it. Certain factors will necessitate certain outcomes. That was determinism. And the question was, what are we as human beings? If we're completely physical things that are determined by all the physical laws of nature, then are we ever really, truly free? And if we're not, how can we talk about obligation, right? How can we talk about morality? Now, there are four responses to the claim of determinism. Number one, we can simply just agree with determinism. Say, yeah, it's true. Determinism is the case and obligations are impossible. Oughts do not really exist. And the person that holds this view would be called the fatalist. You would be called a hard determinist. It's a view that we call incompatible, or it's an incompatibilist view. So we'd say, freedom, determinism, they don't fit together. So we get rid of freedom and you're left with this hard determinism. Okay, that's view number one. View number two is we could agree with certain aspects of the deterministic model and then try to demonstrate that responsibility and obligation are actually compatible with determinism. We call this a compatible view, that there is freedom, there is determinism, and somehow they do fit together. It's kind of a softer view of determinism, and we'll go into this in a little bit. I'd say at least the compatibilist view has room for ethics. Then you also have view three, which is the libertarian view, and that is a view that is also incompatibilist, in that determinism and freedom don't fit together, but instead of getting rid of freedom, they get rid of determinism and say, yes, things are free. And they conclude that it's real. Okay. And then the fourth view, of course, is not to know. Right? How do you know what's the case? Are things determined or are things free? I don't know. I'm going to punt and just be called an agnostic and move on from there. Okay. So there are our four views. Let's take a look at the first three, really. So fatalism, the first view, there is no actual freedom, and therefore there is no actual ethics or moral responsibility in any sense. And a good example of this would be somebody like B.F. Skinner, right? A behaviorist who believes that everything we do is kind of conditioned response mechanism. The way, Pavlov's dog can be trained to salivate at the ringing of a bell. Human beings are just a little bit more complicated than that, but nonetheless, the behaviorist model is a very deterministic and incompatibilist model. Then we've got compatibilism, or soft determinism. And since I've already talked about Aristotle, I'd say Aristotle actually falls in this category, as well as one of the very famous ancient philosophers, Augustine of Hippo, who was an early Christian philosopher and a great theologian, who writes on this issue of freedom. And he comes at it from a religious point of view because he recognizes the omniscience of God. If you've got the Christian view of divinity, that God knows all future events, that entails that these events are going to happen. And the question is, if these events necessarily happen, is God just when he punishes people from things that couldn't have been otherwise? Okay, now I'm not going to get into this issue of how you answer this idea of are things in the future necessary just because God knows things with certainty. And again, this gets into a huge theological thing I don't have time to get into. But basically, let's go back to Augustine and say what he considers as freedom is going to be this minimal definition. So he concludes that freedom is defined as simply being in one's own power. And that's sufficient to justify the concept of moral responsibility. So if something is in your power in some sense, then it's not wrong for God to hold you accountable for that. Okay, and you can reward or punish behavior accordingly. If you desire to do X, and if you can do X without external impediments, something blocking you, or if one is not externally forced to do it against one's will, then we could say you're free in respect to X. So when you do X, then you're responsible for X. Freedom and responsibility, therefore, are compatible with some sense of determinism. Okay. Now, the modern take would be, motivated by the idea that humans are not exempt from determinism that's found in the rest of the universe. Obviously, I fall to the ground just like anybody else when I trip. Yet moral judgments of right and wrong are applicable to events like robbing a convenience store, where they're not applicable to events like tripping and falling or falling down the stairs or anything like that. These are not the same types of things as far as moral worth go. A modern compatibilist maintains the concept of freedom and responsibility while accepting scientific determinism and causal laws anyways. Okay, to reconcile these, it's sufficient for the modern to see that the individual is to be understood as an author of his own acts via the reasoning process. So if you're the author of your own actions through a reasoning process, and that you do have something within your ability, then that's all that matters for freedom. Now, some people don't think that's enough, such as a libertarian. A libertarian, remember, is incompatible, so they're going to dismiss determinism and affirm freedom. And they're going to say, no matter what the conditions are, no matter what antecedent factors are there, those factors are still compatible with you doing A or not doing A. Okay, that's A or non-A, according like I have on the screen. So, if somebody pulls a gun on you, you've got $100 in your pocket, you're in a dark alley, all these various conditions come into play. You're in a bad place at the wrong time, and somebody says, give me your money. You still have the freedom to either give the money over or not give the money over. Nothing is forcing you to, really. Okay, it might feel that way at the moment, but that might be an example of libertarian freedom. Now, the libertarian argument is basically that soft determinism is not completely true. It's only half true. All right. The ability to act, being in one's own power, is only part of the thing. So number one, if we're responsible, then there must be freedom. On this compatibilist view, they say there's not any real freedom. Okay. Therefore, there's no real responsibility on that account. Responsibility requires freedom, and freedom has to have two parts, not just one. Has to have the ability to do what we want to do, but it also has to have access to true alternatives. That's part two. Okay, the soft compatibilist embraces number one, the ability to do what we want. Number two, that there have to be true alternatives that you could have done otherwise. So if one performs a certain act under conditions A, B, and C, then the person is free for that act, as long as it's also possible that you could have done Y instead of X. Okay, I didn't read that exactly right, but hopefully you got what I was saying. So here's the question. Is there some type of libertarian freedom out there? Do we have freedom, or are we determined? Now, if you appeal to actual experience, I think it's actually impossible to prove either one. Okay, here's what we get from our own experience. We feel that we could have done otherwise, and we believe that we could have done otherwise. We feel free, and we believe that we're free. And determinism comes along and says those beliefs and feelings are at best illusions. You're not really free at all. Now, how do you prove freedom? How do you prove determinism? Well, the libertarian says you can't prove determinism, and the determinist, I think, rightly says you can't prove freedom. So, for instance, I'll take out this pen, try not to drop it this time, and if I put that pen on the desk, I think I'm free at this moment to either pick up the pen or to not pick up the pen. Well, now the next thing I'm going to do is make a choice and act, and I'm going to pick up the pen. Now, my sense is that I was free not to do that. I could have done otherwise. But I can't ever prove that I could actually have done otherwise, because I can never go back to that moment and do other than I did. As a matter of fact, I can't go back to that moment at all. So even though I feel free, I can't prove that I was free. Of course, I can't really prove that I was determined to do that either. So we've got an impasse. There's two different views, neither one's provable. Now, here's where the libertarian argument comes into play, because they believe determinism, again, likewise, impossible to prove. And as a theory, determinism, for it to be a good theory, should be able to account for the data. As a matter of fact, that's how we judge theories to be good or bad. Do they account for the data that's presented? Now, there is empirical data here. It's not just picking up the pen or doing this action or that action. It's the experience of feeling free while I'm doing it that is part of the data. And determinism as a theory doesn't explain that primary data of my experience of feeling free. So the libertarian would say that's justifiable then to be skeptical about determinism. It's not as good a theory as the theory of free will because of the way it doesn't jive with our normal experience. So the libertarian actually says the burden of proof is on the determinist to prove that we're determined, not on the libertarian to prove that they're free. Okay? In other words, the determinist has to prove their point, and unless they do that, unless they assume that burden and then prove their side, I'm justified in going along with the assumption that I am truly free. Okay? So, as far as ethics go, we're justified in assuming we have the possibility to do things freely. We have the possibility to assume responsibility, to go along with obligation, and therefore moral language works if I'm free. And I'm justified in believing that. That's all I need at this point, is to be able to say that I'm justified in believing that I'm free. Okay, now that's a lot of material in quite a bit of time. So what I'm going to do is sign off in just a second, go back again, review this material. In the next session, what I hope to do is bring you through moral relativism with a response, the absolutist point of view, look briefly at logical positivism, and then wrap up with a little discussion on a perspective on existentialism. And hopefully we'll be able to do that very soon. So again, thank you, and good luck studying.